I'm delighted to be here with this wonderful crowd and this wonderful speaker to introduce Albie Sachs speaking about punitive justice versus restorative justice. I've given a lot of intros in my life for academic speakers, writers, artists, and usually you say X got his or her BA in this year, and they got their PhD in this year, and they published the book in this year, and they published another book. Well, there's a lot more to this bio, I'm here to tell you. In fact, there's so much that I couldn't even find the year that Albie Sachs graduated from college, but he did, he tells me. He was born in South Africa in 1935 and educated in Cape Town, where at university, in his second year of law school, he participated in the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign launched by the ANC and the South African Indian Congress. 3 years later, he attended the Congress of the Peoples outside Cape Town, where the statement of core principles of the freedom movement was adopted, the Freedom Charter. He began practicing as advocate in Cape Town at the age of 21. That's the age of some people in this room. As an advocate defending people charged under racist laws and repressive measures, many of them facing death sentences. Harassed, menaced, detained by the secret police, and finally placed in solitary confinement, Albie Sachs, like many of his compatriots, went into exile, moving in 1966 to England and then in 1977 to Mozambique, until the attempt on his life in 1988, when he returned to England. In 1990, after the fall of apartheid, he returned to South Africa, where President Nelson Mandela appointed him to the new constitutional, first to the Constitutional Committee and then to the Constitutional Court. Albie is a prolific writer, as all of those in his class will already know, as well as a path-breaking jurist. His books, Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter, on his recovery from the car bomb, and the Free Diary of Albie Sachs, move elegantly and subtly between his personal experience and the stunning history of which he's helped make and of which he's been a part. Albie retired from the court in 2009, which is South Africa's misfortune, but it's our gain because he has come here to be our dazzling first Posen Professor of Human Rights. And please welcome me then in, please join me in welcoming Albie Sachs.
Just before I start, last week we had this noise. You went out, the noise stopped.
Am I supposed to leave?
No.
Like there was no causal relationship.
Okay, incidents, okay. I'd been a judge for about 2 years. My phone rang and a voice said, "It's reception here, Judge. There's a man called Henry who says that he has an appointment to see you." I said, "Send him through." I was very eager to meet Henry. He telephoned me a week before to say that he had organized the placing of the bomb in my car. That blew me up and cost me my right arm and the sight of an eye. He was now going to the Truth Commission. Was I willing to see him? And I said yes. And I walked to the security gate, I opened the gate, and I saw Henry. And he's looking at me and I'm looking at him. And I see in his eyes, so this is the man I tried to kill. And I'm thinking, so this is the man who tried to kill me. We'd never met before. We didn't hate each other. We hadn't fought over money or love or position. But he was on that side and I was on this side. We walked down the longish corridor to my chambers, and I remember he strode like a soldier, and I tried to slow him down with my best judge's ambulation. And we sat down and we talked. And we talked. And he told me about what wonderful parents he had and the university he'd been to, and he was a good student, and he'd done well, and he'd been recruited into the army, and with pride, how he had advanced in the army to become what in effect was one of the commanders of the head squads. And about the placing of the bomb, and then the explosion had been delayed for a while for various political reasons, and he had quarreled with the person above him in the chain of command. He dropped out of the picture, and he read afterwards about the explosion and my being blown up, and he realized that was the bomb that he had organized in my car. We chatted. Eventually I stood up and said, "Henry, I have to get on with my work." But I said, "Go to the Truth Commission. Tell them what you know. Maybe we'll meet one day. Normally I shake a person's hand when I say goodbye. I can't shake your hand now, but who knows?" And when we walked back to the security gate, he was shuffling along, almost like a defeated person. And he went out, and I closed the door. Now, what was this Truth Commission that he was going to speak to? How did it function? The origins, and this is not very well known, lay in a very passionate meeting of the National Executive Committee of the ANC about 9 months before our first democratic elections. These elections, some of you might remember seeing it on television, April 27th, 1994, for the first time, black and white voting as equals in South Africa. This was in the run-up. And the issue on the National Executive of the ANC agenda was what to do about a report that had been produced. It was called the Motsunyane Commission, which had been set up by the ANC to inquire into violations of human rights committed by the ANC against people who were captives of the ANC during the liberation struggle in camps in Angola. And the Commission had reported that, in fact, there were a number of captives who were treated in a very brutal fashion, and they'd only heard one side of the story, but there was a prima facie case. It was enough to require the ANC to take appropriate measures to respond to these allegations. What to do? There were about 80 of us on the NEC, and some of us stood up and said, "It's very clear. We set up the commission, it's reported, there were these violations, and we've got to follow through." And others said, "Would that be right? You've got to remember the circumstances. We had nobody trained to be guards of camps like this. Young people, 19, 20, 21. The circumstances were very difficult. There was a war going on in Angola. The camps were being bombed from the air by South Africa. We've got to take account of those circumstances." And I remember Paro Jordan, one of the leading intellectuals of the ANC, spent a lot of time in the United States, standing up. He has quite a high-pitched voice and saying, "Comrades, I've learned something very interesting today. There's such a thing as regime torture, and that is bad, and ANC torture, that's all right. Thank you for enlightening me." And he sat down. It's a very intense debate, and one of those issues you couldn't determine by a show of hands what to do. It's a deep moral question. And eventually someone got to his feet and said, "What would my mother say?" We often use the figure of my mother in debates. My mother not being my mother or even his actual mother, but an African woman with maybe 2 or 3 years schooling, not very knowledgeable about the world, but with a strong sense of right and wrong. And he said, my mother would say there's something weird about the ANC, because here you are quite correctly examining the faults and the violations committed by the ANC, but you're saying nothing about the decades and centuries of violation of the rights of the majority. Where's the balance? Where's the equity? Where's the justice? And after he said that, Kader Asmal, who'd been professor of international law in exile, Trinity College in Dublin, done a lot of work at the UN, stood up and said, what we need in South Africa is a Truth Commission that would look at all violations of human rights from all sides. It shouldn't just be one political organization doing it. It's the nation, it's the state that must take responsibility. So paradoxically in South Africa, our Truth Commission emerged because of a desire by the leadership of the ANC to come back to the country with clean hands, to be willing to examine its own violations, its own crimes, its own depredations. Not long after that, we signed, sealed, and delivered what we thought was the final constitution, the original interim constitution, temporary constitution of the ANC, the final draft of it. And I was able to go to London to report back to a body called the Catholic Institute of International Relations that had given us a lot of support over the years. They wanted to know what's going on, and I'd been too busy with negotiations as part of the negotiating team to be able to come and report to them. But now we had our constitution. And they put me up at a little hotel near King's Cross. Now I mention that because a little hotel near King's Cross in 93 was pretty dingy. And I was amused because as the negotiations had advanced, our accommodation got better. So the very last week, 11 days, we negotiated non-stop. We were staying at the Holiday Inn at the airport. Now I'm back to my grassroots type accommodation. And the relevance was that there was no fax machine there. Remember fax machines? Those things that just get tick, 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 tick. And I'm about to go to sleep. There's a knock at the door. Terribly sorry to disturb you, but we've received a fax from the National Executive Committee of the ANC, from the leadership, saying it's very, very urgent, there's a crisis. And I read the fax. And the fax says that the security forces in South Africa are saying that they'd been promised by the then President de Klerk of the white government that if democracy came to South Africa, they would get amnesty. There was nothing in the Constitution that spoke about amnesty. They felt betrayed by him. And there were indications that Nelson Mandela was not unsympathetic to their anger in the sense that they'd been promised something which was not being delivered on. And the point they made was that they had in fact defended the negotiation process. There was one day when extreme right-wingers actually crashed into the building in an armored car. They said that they knew of plans to bomb polling stations all over the country at the time of the first elections. And they would do everything in their power to prevent that from happening. And the implication was they'd infiltrate the organizations, they would risk their lives to save the democratic elections, but not if they were going to go to jail afterwards. That was just asking too much. They didn't threaten a coup d'etat to take over the government. They simply said they will resign from the security forces and maybe leave the country. So what to do? And I remember this little hotel didn't have spare-headed notepaper, turning the fax around and writing a response on the back, and suggesting that amnesty be granted in the Constitution, but not a blanket amnesty, granted in liaison with a truth commission, that if people came forward and told the truth on an individual basis about the violations they'd been responsible for, then they should get amnesty. I wrote it at the back, and we sent the facts back to South Africa. So it was this combination of the internal debate in the ANC, what to do about violations committed by our camp guards against captives, captives sent to kill us, to maim us. It wasn't putting down dissidents or opposition or factions or anything like that, who were ill-treated in that way, and how to respond to the issues raised by the security forces. And so a provision was put in very, very late in the day into the Constitution, saying that we recall the untold injustices of the past, but in dealing with them, we respond in a spirit of reconciliation, not retribution, and a spirit of Ubuntu, a term that I will refer to later in this presentation, and not vengeance. And that people will be entitled to amnesty under terms and conditions to be established by the new parliament. So that became the constitutional foundation of our Truth Commission. It emerged from our history and our needs. It wasn't saying, oh, wouldn't it be a good idea? We can find out what happened in the past. There were two very, very pressing needs, and I'm sure that's one reason why the Commission had such a powerful impact. We spent a year on the legislation. The new Minister of Justice, an old friend who'd been in and out of jail, who'd been nearly assassinated himself when his heart medication was swapped, said it was the toughest job he had. Almost the whole year was spent just on preparing the legislation. And in the end, the Commission had a tripartite structure. There was the section that traveled around the country listening to people speaking about how their rights had been violated. It was headed by Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Emeritus then of the Anglican Church, and a wonderful choice, and quite a broadly based range of people sitting with him. And as he explained, their job was to give voice to the little people who hadn't been heard. I'd written books, I'd been on television, I'd been interviewed by the New York Times. My story was told many, many times. But there were thousands and thousands of people who'd been through much worse than I went through, whose story had never been heard. So in addition to the violence that had been done to them, or to their children, or their husbands, or their wives, or their neighbors, there was the violence to their psyche. They couldn't speak about it. It was being denied. Now they had a chance to tell their story. And they didn't meet in the big town hall and places of celebration. They went to school halls and church halls in the community. And they'd start the proceedings with a hymn and quiet singing in which everybody would join, including Tutu and the others. And when the witnesses spoke, they would have a comforter with them to put an arm around the person, to provide some water. People shrieked. It was very emotional, very intense. And the critical thing was highly publicized. I felt that you would never get the killers, the torturers, the murderers to come forward and tell their story if it was going to be in public. And I'd argued for hearings to be in camera. Many civil society organizations didn't like this Truth Commission. They spoke about accountability. But if you can't have trials, at the very least, if you're going to give amnesty, do it in public so that people know what's happening. They were right, I was wrong. Unfortunately, their view prevailed. And it was the publicizing of the Truth Commission that gave it its enormous impact, because we saw on television, we heard on the radio, we read in the press. It was our people, our faces, our voices, our tears, our anguish, our denials. In the body language, in the dress. We had wonderful interpreters. It was so important people could speak in their own language. And a whole play has been written about the translators, lost in translation, and the impact on them of hearing these awful stories. And now they have to convey to the public as accurately and spontaneously as they can the stories that they're hearing. There was one famous moment where Tutu was so overcome he just put his head down and he cried. It was a genuine emotion. He has a very strong sense of theatre. How many of you have attended a gathering where Desmond Tutu spoke? Quite a few. He knows his audience, and he plays his audience brilliantly. And you don't become a leader in the Anglican Church if you aren't very shrewd and very smart, with a strong sense of public relations. But he had all that, but he had tremendous passion and humanity and soul. And so he gave a sense of rightness, if you like, righteousness in the nice sense of the word, to all the proceedings. And something like 10,000 people testified at different hearings throughout the country, and another 10,000 had their testimony recorded in writing. The second section dealt with reparations. To my mind, I'm giving a purely personal view, it was the least successful of the three. Something went, I think, amiss. The focus was on the amount of money to be paid. It was the wrong focus. The focus should have been on how the community, the society could be involved at a local level, at a national level, in helping with the repair, in gardens, nurseries, nursery schools. I heard of one marvelous idea to build a bridge over a railway line in a particular area, to name it after somebody who'd been tortured to death in that area, in wheelchairs, in stipends, in bursaries. It would have personalized and given an intimate and very human character to the idea of repair and reparation. Instead, it ended up with a rather unpleasant debate about how much was to be paid, when it should be paid, and somehow it's never enough. It's never enough. It's never enough. I'm just wondering if we should open a window. Thank you. Maybe a couple of windows, yeah. No, at least for a while. The third section received the testimony of people who acknowledged that they'd violated fundamental rights and the law, and who asked for amnesty. In some ways, this was the most dramatic. And this had 2 judges and about 3 lay people. And they had to decide whether or not the evidence given showed that the offense had been committed in the course of the political struggle, and there was some degree of proportionality between the offense being committed and the political action. And so the ANC came forward and acknowledged the violations of rights in the camps. But overwhelmingly it was members of the security forces who testified. And there were some very, very dramatic hearings, and we saw it on television. The one, possibly the most remembered, it was so simple, was a chap called Tony Yengeni, who'd been in the underground resistance, been captured. And he asked a certain Sergeant Benzine, show us, Sergeant Benzine, how you told us to lie on the floor, you put wet canvas bags over our heads, and you choked us until we thought we were dying. And somebody lay on the floor, and there was a bag. It wasn't a wet bag. The bag was put over. Benzine bent down. He tightened it. He got up. And Tony Yengeni said to him, tell us, how can one human being do this to another human being? It was such a simple question. And Benzine cried. And we all saw his face on television. This man who'd had the power of life and death, literally, was crying. It was the huge moral defeat of apartheid. And not because he was being whipped or beaten or tortured or compelled to make a confession, but because he wanted to escape liability for what he'd done. He'd come forward, he was asking for amnesty, and he paid the price, at least in acknowledgement and in shame. There were major cases where amnesty was not granted. Chris Hani, one of the very top ANC leaders who'd been a leader of the armed struggle, General Secretary of the Communist Party of South Africa, a hugely popular person, was out jogging one day. I remember it was Easter time. He came home, sweating a little bit, and a man from Poland called Walus, extreme right-winger, had a gun and shot him through the head, hoping to provoke a racial response, a bloodbath, get some kind of international intervention, prevent democracy from coming. It so happened that a neighboring family in the area where Chris was living, a white woman, quite conservative, Afrikaans background, saw what happened, phoned the police, and Walus was captured almost with a smoking gun. He applied for amnesty together with one of his co-conspirators. The commission said, you're not telling the whole truth. You're holding back. Who supplied the gun? Who was behind you? You're not getting amnesty because you're not complying with the conditions. Steve Biko, about whom some of you might have lived, the Black consciousness leader, wonderful, brave, articulate person, standing up for his rights, the rights of the oppressed community, picked up, beaten up, taken almost comatose in a long car journey to Pretoria, and he dies. The police claim that when he was being interrogated, he jumped up and he attacked them. They pushed him back. He fell. He knocked his head on a radiator, and that's why he died. And the advocate, George Bezos, appearing for the family, said, well, if it was an accident, you don't need amnesty because there's no crime committed. And again, the Amnesty Commission said, you haven't told the whole truth, and amnesty was refused. But there were many cases of awful crimes committed. The assassination of Ruth First by a letter bomb at the Center for African Studies in Maputo, Mozambique. Craig Williamson, who'd authored it, acknowledged what he'd done. People loathed him, hated him. Ruth's daughter has written a novel and stories about this, but he got amnesty because he complied with the conditions. And that was the arrangement. You can't pick and choose. You have the rule of law, you have these principles, and you follow through. So the Truth Commission then had an enormous impact in our country. It's highly controversial. There are people from the radical side, if you like, who say, how could we let these murderers and torturers walk freely in the streets? How could you? And there are people from a more conservative background who are saying, you didn't have due process of law with the ordinary cross-examination. People just came up and told their stories. And there was a bias against the Inkatha Freedom Party, who boycotted the proceedings and didn't get an amnesty. There was a challenge from that side as well. I was concerned about another dimension. I was concerned, speaking now, thinking as a lawyer, how can it be so much truth poured out at the Truth Commission, with that sense, that ring of truth and the impact, and you have a trial, and you don't know at the end of the trial. Remember the O.J. Simpson trial? Went on for weeks. At the end of it, jury gives its decision, people argue about what the hell happened there. I'm sure everybody in this room has got his or her own mind clearly, but not maybe everybody has the same. Michael Jackson, long trial, end of the trial. What the hell happened in those bedrooms? You don't really know. And it worried me. As a lawyer, you don't get truth that you can depend upon through due process of law, and here the truth just poured out without the ordinary procedural devices of a criminal trial. To help me through this, I decided there are 4 dimensions, kinds of truth. There's what I call microscopic or observational truth. You define a field, you measure certain variables over a period of time, you note the change and you explain the change. And it might be in positive science, it might be in a legal dispute. The dispute is framed by the pleadings, we call them, the documents, the indictment, the evidence is produced, and a finding is made on the basis of the evidence. Observational truth. Then you've got logical truth. It's the truth implicit in a proposition, a statement. It doesn't need any further observation. And for some reason, the example that comes to mind was when I'd finished writing this Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter. I was just recovering from the bomb. I was in New York. I took the manuscript to Albie, up on the 8th floor somewhere, I think, West Central Park. And I gave it to her, and she said, come back. I came back a few days. She said she liked it very much, and so on and so forth. And within a few minutes, I knew Abby's whole life. I'd had an agent in London for 15 years. I knew nothing about her, except she was a very good agent. The American agent just opened up. And she ended up, after a few minutes, by saying, and let's face it, Albie, I won't try her accent, men are a fundamentally flawed species. Now, I'm a man, so the logic is I'm fundamentally flawed. That's implicit in the statement. And most of litigation, criminal or civil, is about combining observational truth with logical truth. And that's due process of law. But then you get a third kind of truth, experiential truth. And the term came to me from having read M.K. Gandhi's My Experiments with Truth. His autobiography written basically about his experiences in South Africa, where he spent 20 years transforming himself from this rather dandy-like barrister from England into the Gandhi with the dhoti and the lean, bare figure, the great leader of the Indian independence struggle. Experiments with truth? We did experiments at school with Bunsen burners and graphs. But what he meant was you have an experience in life and you question the experience. You think about it and you try and understand it. And he wrote very movingly in this book about some very powerful experiences. The one, again, that stands out very much in my mind was in 1906, when Zulu-speaking people in the colony of Natal, the British colony of Natal, to become part of the Union of South Africa, rose up in what was called the Bambata Rebellion. And they were very brutally crushed, and the captives were flogged, 50 lashes, maybe even more. And Gandhi had joined the medical auxiliary of the colonial troops, and he would go and wash the backs of the Zulu prisoners after they'd been lashed. And the soldiers would jeer at him, Gandhi, for being so soft. And he said, if the human body can be the site of so much pain, I mustn't derive pleasure from my body. And that was when he took his decision to give up sex. I might say he didn't consult his wife before he took that decision. But the point was, Gandhi didn't start off as a Gandhian, applying Gandhian principles to his life. He had experiences and derived certain precepts from those experiences, which then taken together constituted what came to be known as Gandhiism afterwards. And the power of the Truth Commission was experiential. You saw, you heard, you felt the drama, the tears, and the people weren't going there. The more they denounced, the bigger damages they would get. There was no connection between the denunciation, the exposure, and the money that they might have received in reparations afterwards. They went just to tell their story, to be heard, to be listened to be believed. And that's what reached us. The fourth is what I call dialogical truth. And that's the multiple strands of information and ideas and pieces of logic and observation that occur in life all the time, that are very strong in an academic setting. There isn't a truth, there isn't a finding that ends the matter. It's the interaction of all of these things. And it was the experiential and dialogical that constituted the strength of our Truth Commission. And the dialogue was very, very intense. It came from all sides, from all the different experiences. And even the Truth Commission itself wasn't just one body. It had a number of members, and each one had a different life experience. And they had arguments and debates and fights, and at times even rancor between them before they could come up with public positions. They weren't just recording our history, they were part of our history. And the Truth Commission wasn't just a chronicle of what happened in South Africa, it was an episode as part of our history. And it was a history that was generalized because we were all party to it through the TV, the radio, the press, and even those who switched off and changed the program were acknowledging the existence of the Truth Commission by trying to boycott it. Why do I feel it was so important? Firstly, it eliminated any possibility of denial, because we were hearing not just from those who had suffered, we were hearing from the perpetrators, who were coming forward not because they'd been tortured or brainwashed, but partly they wanted to relieve themselves of their burden, maybe, but they didn't want to be prosecuted in future. They had a motive to do so. They didn't tell all the truth, maybe not even most of the truth, but a lot of the truth. And this was coming out of the mouths of the people, the Sergeant Benzines and the others. There was just no scope after that for saying, this is an ANC invention. These things are exaggerated, because the very ones responsible had come forward to tell their stories. It was important that it was across the board. If it had simply been people on the side of the old apartheid regime coming forward, and no mention made of the violation of the rights of prisoners of the ANC, there would have been a lack of balance. Human beings are human beings. They might be horrible people sent by a racist, authoritarian, apartheid enemy to destroy the leaders of a liberation struggle. They are still human beings. You don't torture them. You don't torture them. And if you do, you account for that. And if you account for that in public, you get amnesty from the Truth Commission. And other groups like that as well. There were some very beautiful, moving moments, but not too many. There wasn't much direct reconciliation in terms of actual victims and their families and actual perpetrators. But some examples were quite memorable. There was one where a chap, I knew him as Rashid, that was his underground name, who's now went on to become a general in the army, had organized the placing of a bomb outside the Air Force officers' headquarters in Pretoria. It exploded, and civilians, not only military people, were injured and killed, and a man was blinded. He came forward, a white person, as it happened. And he told his story. And he listened to the story by Rashid, and afterwards the man who was blinded said, "Can I speak to Mr. Abu Bakr?" And that was agreed upon. And he said, "It's very hard for me, having lost my sight, but you were fighting for your cause." And he shook his hand. And Rashid had explained that looking back, it was very painful that in the course of the struggle, people like this man were injured, and he felt deep sorrow at that being one of the consequences of his actions. It's one of the problems in our country. The huge gain was what somebody called shifting from knowledge to acknowledgement. Knowledge is information, data, facts. And we knew that people were being killed in detention, that there were assassinations. That wasn't new. Even statistics were out. Acknowledgement moves from knowledge to say, where was I? What would I have done? What are the moral consequences? How can we prevent this from happening again? Are we listening to the people concerned? And in particular, where was I? What was I doing? And so the press came forward. Where were you in the press? Just picking up all this information from the security police, broadcasting it as though it was the truth. And many of the journalists expressed their shame that they'd done that. And other journalists showed how stories that they tried to present had been spiked. The religious bodies, where were you? Some were praying for the forces of repression. Others had segregation in their own churches and schools. Others said we must dream about the other world, not about violations of rights in this world. And we judges were sitting back, smirking a little bit, until they said, and where were the judges? And we had very, very intense debates amongst the judges. And interestingly enough, the judges who were the best under apartheid, some who are now on our constitutional court, who used what tiny space available people's rights as much as they go to the Truth Commission to say, we didn't do enough, we could have done more. And the ones who simply said, no, we were just carrying out the law, that was the law at the time, we're not going forward, we've got nothing to apologize about, didn't want to. In the end, it was decided we didn't want to split the judiciary down the middle into the good judges and the bad judges. We're trying now to reconstruct the whole institution. But the 4 top judges issued a statement, I think unique in the world, saying the judiciary failed. We failed. The judiciary, first of all, implemented manifestly unjust racist laws. They were an essential ingredient in racial oppression in South Africa. And secondly, the judiciary turned a blind eye to the torture, to the violations, never believed the people, not never, on the whole, believed the security police. When people were taken out of 1 year, 2 years of solitary confinement, you couldn't see any marks, there were no bandages, there were no bruises, and complete denial, and the judges accepted that nothing untoward had happened. So there was a strong acknowledgement. But unfortunately, judges often are not clever at projecting to the public. And so this document was sent. There should have been some publicized meeting, and the public to this day don't know that there was, in effect, a very, very powerful judicial mea culpa, I think unique in the world in that respect. Did it bring about reconciliation in South Africa? I think it opened the way to reconciliation. As long as there were these hidden, denied crimes, matters of intense emotion and rancor and anger, you couldn't move forward. But as long as the huge injustices in our society, still based on race, continued, you're not going to get full reconciliation. In very simple terms, after a day's hearing before Bishop Tutu, before the Amnesty Commission, the security police in their suits, little moustaches, reading from their statements, I just wish they'd be more open and warm and not so lawyer-like and police-like and more like human beings. But it was something. They'd climb into their Toyotas and their Hondas, they'd drive home to a nice home. Maybe their children would say, Daddy, is that what you were doing? Maybe the wife who was wondering, maybe he was having an affair all the time. You weren't having an affair, you were torturing somebody. Maybe, I don't know. But the people who'd suffered so much would climb into his little minibus taxis or walk home and go to their shanties and their shacks. So the inequality continued. And until that inequality is addressed, you're not going to have full substantive reconciliation. But we opened the way to that. We opened the way to that. And all sorts of gestures have taken place in our country that involve that conversion of negativity into positivity. And I feel so proud of what we achieved with the Constitutional Court, building it in the heart of the prison where Gandhi and Mandela were locked up. So that you could see the old building, as the architects say, and the new talking to each other with the great African steps in between. And a beautiful new democratic open building next to this harsh prison. You achieve that reconciliation through concrete acts all the time in that way. And we're still working at it. So that's now the history of the Truth Commission. We had one case, one challenge in the Constitutional Court. It's called the Azapu case, where relatives of Steve Biko and others said, we can understand that you grant indemnity from criminal prosecution in order to get the truth. but surely we can claim civil damages. And that portion of the Act denies people their right to have their disputes settled at a fair trial as the Constitution grants. We rejected that argument because the Constitution itself allowed for the Truth Commission quite expressly, and so it was constitutionally mandated. And in I think, one of the most exquisite legal opinions ever written by anybody, Justice Ismail Muhammad explained why the search for truth justified the granting of amnesty, painful though it was. And anybody interested in poetic, legal English literature, and anybody interested in TRCs are advised to try and get hold of the judgment by Ishmael. Portions of it are reproduced in my book, sections of it. But I thought, okay, now we've dealt with that, and the Truth Commission is out here, and the Constitutional Court functions in a completely different realm. End of matter. We had a case called Bikoko. Bikoko is a Sesotho word. It means a chicken. And it was a libel case. The damages, I think, would be regarded as derisory in the United States. It could have been $15,000, appeal coming to us. And the issue was a town clerk. Do you have an official town clerk? It's sort of a bureaucrat, an official manager of the municipality. Had censured a leading figure in the provincial government because he'd overused his time on his cell phone. And he had put in for $200, and he was only limited to $150 for the month. This political figure was very angry. And when asked about it, he told the press, he did this because I belong to the ANC, and he was in league with people who are against us. And the official was annoyed. He said, I did this because I was doing my duty. And he sued for damages. And he got, say, $10,000, $15,000 damages in the High Court. The matter came on appeal to us. And the main technical issue was a question of legal privilege. And he's performing functions as a member of the government, and statements that he's making in Parliament, in the legislature, and can he be sued for damages for that? Or something like that. And we dealt with that at a technical level, and we held that this wasn't part and parcel of the deliberative process, so he wasn't covered by the legal privilege. But I was interested in the question of the payment of monetary damages. And I felt there's something wrong here. How are you restoring his dignity and his reputation? By giving him money. And do you restore his dignity more by giving him more money? And it seemed to go totally against the African tradition of trying to bring people together and to use apology and looking into each other's eyes and saying we all live together in the same community. And if you've said something that's libelous, that traduces somebody else, and we establish that you've done that, you damn well apologize. And you say so, and you do it in public, and the person's reputation is vindicated, and if you apologize, that's more or less the end of the matter. You pay the costs of the proceedings, and you both walk out proud. So I challenged the idea of money damages being paid in relation to an attack on a person's reputation. And interestingly enough, when Harry Wolff, the former Lord Chief Justice of England, wrote a preface for my book, of all the things I dealt with, the Truth Commission, social and economic rights, torture, and so on, the one thing he picked up on expressly, in particular, was the payment of excessive damages for libel cases. He says it's getting out of hand, and in particular, he'd like to endorse my statements on that. But the rationale was interesting because it presupposed in the judgment I wrote, and I got support from my colleague Yvonne Machoro, it presupposed a different way of looking at the judicial function. It's not simply to determine right and wrong and to punish, either by sending to jail or by ordering payment of money. Is to try and bring the parties together, not just in a little settlement for the sake of settlement, but to open up the issues and to re-establish what had been a ruptured set of relationships in the community, to re-establish those relationships. And that's very strong in African judicial reasoning. And the term used is Ubuntu. I am a person because you're a person. I can't separate my humanity from acknowledgement of your humanity. So instead of the world being populated by individuals on the basis of watch out, you're surrounded by enemies who are trying to do you down. And if they do that, you've got to have a strong legal shield and you've got to have strong weapons to deal with them. We're living in a world where we're interdependent. We need each other. And my respect for you is dependent on your respect for me. And the role of the judiciary is a different one. And so I explored this area of Ubuntu with some very interesting material coming forward. It's very strong, the idea of restorative justice in juvenile justice. And Northwestern University has a very distinguished role in that regard because the whole concept of child justice, I believe, was invented there, and Chicago was put on the map for May Day and juvenile justice in the 19th century. But it's a concept that goes beyond just juvenile justice, where you have diversion, you bring the families together, you try and get a rapprochement, you try and keep the person outside of jail, where you're simply going to intensify the antisocial behavior and conduct, and you're restoring a rupture in the community. And I came across a case of a High Court judge hearing a murder case in which a man had killed the son of the chief witnesses for the prosecution. There'd been a lot of provocation, and the judge was considering what sentence to impose. And he asked the mother of the murdered child, "Are you willing to speak to the accused?" And she said, "Yes. He acknowledges what he did, and I will speak to him. And I have to live together with his family in the community, and one day he's going to come out of jail if he goes to jail. Where's he going to go? Where's he going to live? He's someone else's child, just like my child was my child." And she more or less indicated that what she wanted from the court was a vindication of the wrongness of the killing and a deep and profound apology from the person concerned. There were grounds in terms of provocation that would have justified a suspended sentence. But the High Court judge wanted to go beyond that. He wanted the court proceedings to help with the healing process. I found this a very, very powerful case. It happened to be a white judge, not from the African cultural community, but he was able to quote decisions by African judges drawing on the spirit of Ubuntu. The last case I'll mention, and now I'm realizing there's a theme beginning to burgeon here that has implications that go well beyond the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, well beyond restorative justice just for children. and I'll conclude with this case. It's called the Port Elizabeth municipality case. It was a difficult case for me. In fact, I had a crisis. I almost thought about leaving the judiciary. It involved proceedings being brought by the Port Elizabeth municipality against about 15 African families living in shacks which they constructed themselves on what's called vacant land belonging to white people living in a very upmarket suburb. The land was nearby for future development. And the owners went to the municipality and said, get them off our land. And I thought, what do I do? I'd been asked to write the first draft of the judgment. I've spent my life fighting for the right of people to get their land back. They were expelled from the land by unjust laws. They don't want to live on that land. They've got nowhere else to go. They put up their shacks there. They've got nowhere else to go. I, as Albie, I can't support an order evicting them. I, Judge Albie Sachs, have sworn an oath to do justice without fear, favor, or prejudice. Can I allow my life in the struggle to prevent me from upholding my judicial oath of office? It was actually very, very serious for me. I speak about it now. Now I'm off the bench. My term of office compulsorily came to an end after 15 years, last October. And the way I saved my seat on the bench was by converting what was an individual moral crisis into a constitutional debate. Because the Constitution said everybody has the right not to be deprived arbitrarily of their property. The fact that there were millions of people living like these 15 families was an indignity not just to them, but to all of us living in South Africa, that we live in a country with means, with capacity, and still millions of our fellow citizens are living in appalling conditions. It affects all of us, our dignity. It assails each one of us. And if the spirit of Ubuntu prevails, and the Bill of Rights is nothing if it's not if it's not Ubuntu writ large in legal form, then somehow we are failing in this country. And what I ordered in the end, on behalf of the court after discussion, was the way of reconciling these two principles was to require some form of mediation and discussion, so that the parties themselves could find a way of resolving the question. And if that's not undertaken, it would not be just and equitable to order their expulsion. I haven't quite finished. I was at a party some years back, and it's the end of the year. We worked very hard. I was tired. The music was loud, and I hear a voice saying, "Albie, Albie." My God, it's Henry. He's beaming, he's smiling. He comes up to me and he said, "Albie, I went to the Truth Commission and I spoke to Bobby and Sue and Farouk." He's using the names of people who are in exile with me who also were victims of the bomb. And I told them everything, and you said that one day. And I said, "Henry, I've only got your face to tell me that what you're saying is the truth." And I put out my hand and I shook his hand. He went away absolutely beaming, and I almost fainted into the arms of my friend who accompanied me there. Now, my presentation used to end there. It's quite a dramatic note, isn't it? But truth doesn't end. I heard afterwards that he'd said the bomb put in my car was in fact intended for my friend Indris Naidu and not for me. And Indris was going around saying, you know that bomb for Albie? That was meant for me. And I'm saying, no, Indris, that's my bomb. And maybe initially it was meant for Indris, and because of the postponement, because he was a mile away, more than 2 miles away, there's no way he could have got into the car and been blown up in that way. In any event, I just felt kind of amused at that bizarre competition between Indris and myself. But after that, I heard another story, and somebody said to me, you know, I was at that party, and we were doing, it was a film group, we were doing a story about Henry van der Westhuizen, and suddenly he went away, and he went home and he cried for 2 weeks. And I was very moved when I heard that. Thank you.
So much of himself and his thoughts tonight. We're nearing the end of our time, but he has agreed to take a few questions. So the floor is open, and he's hoping that he likes to, we'll actually take maybe 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah.
And probably that will be it for the evening. So let's have...
Okay, we have one here, one at the back.
Yeah.
Please.
I'd be curious to know what Henry said to you in that first conversation to convince you to grant him
An audience.
right. I mean, he wants to see, he wants to come to get.
Okay, why did I even speak to him? Why did I say come up? Okay, thank you, nice question. Can someone write this down for me?
In the English department, we had a visit this year from 2 South African scholars, Jane Taylor and David Blund. They may be known to you. And they taught a course on sincerity. And after hearing you, I now understand better why they were interested in that topic. Because at a number of points in your talk, including at the end, you invoke this criterion of sincerity, which in a certain way displaces truth. As the measure of what constitutes an appropriate apology. And if the apology is now going to do the work done by damages in another legal context, it raises a whole series of procedural questions about how you know an apology is sincere. So how does a legal system regrounded on a notion of the sincerity of an apology work? What are its criteria of evidence and so on?
And following up on Jim Chandler, one of the criticisms I've heard precisely this about the apologies, that so many of those apologizing treated the act of apology, I heard it compared to putting a coin in a vending machine and expecting forgiveness. And so I wondered if you could address that along with this.
Okay, last one.
2 questions about criticisms, potential criticisms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You mentioned 2 cases that weren't given forgiveness, right? And the deal was supposed to be that if you didn't come forth and tell the truth, you would still have the possibility of being prosecuted. As far as I know, those prosecutions never happened. But I'd like to hear from your perspective that, more about that. Yeah. And the second thing is, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is supposed to be part and parcel of a larger package, including reparations. And those reparations never happened. They never they evaporated, although it was part of the package. And I'd like to get your response as to that second shortcoming of the Truth and Reconciliation process.
Henry broke ranks with the military. They tried to dissuade their soldiers from coming to the Truth Commission. I was curious. I was curious. I had no idea who'd been responsible. And it's hard living with mysteries around your life. You want to clear up. You want to humanize, personalize, make it real. So he was making a gesture, going to the Truth Commission. He had information not just about me, but other actions involving other people. He was contributing to a proper writing of South African history. But I think the real thing was a human curiosity. I didn't forgive him. I never used the word forgiveness. I don't feel I have a right to forgive anybody. I don't actually see the world in terms of forgiveness. It's not part of my mental vision. But I was pleased that he'd moved on a bit from being a soldier who blindly and proudly obeyed orders to having some introspection, some reflection on what he'd been doing, and who was willing to acknowledge what he'd done in public and the things he'd been responsible for. I don't know if any of you have seen the film Invictus. In a way, it deals with a similar philosophical approach. I wanted to live in the same country with the Henrys of that country. Not I wanted to, I was going to live in the same country. I didn't like the idea of an enemy out there lurking. I don't know who he is. So the more he came clean, the more he came forward, in a strange kind of a way, the freer I could feel. You don't sit down and analyze your thoughts. I just know instinctively, intuitively, when he phoned, I said, yes, I'd like to meet him. And I don't use the word forgiveness. And the Truth Commission didn't forgive anybody in the sense of saying it's okay, it's past, get on with your life. The Truth Commission simply granted amnesty from criminal prosecution and civil liability. And there were some people, particularly from the African community, who said the state can't forgive. I can forgive. But I'll only forgive if the person comes to me and speaks to me. This is the African tradition. And apologizes to me in a way that I feel is genuine and sincere. The state can't do that. But the state, in other words, wasn't in the business of giving individual forgiveness, nor in the confessional business, if you like, the way that Tutu saw it, of saying, I forgive thee for thy transgressions. It wasn't like that at all. Certainly for me, it didn't have that particular context. As far as the apology is concerned, what matters is the public acknowledgement by the traducer of the wrongfulness and of the injury done. That's what helps to restore the dignity and the worth of the person who's been injured. And at least in formal terms, it's got to be unconditional and wholehearted. Whether deep in that person's heart they are truly contrite is something that a court couldn't really try to assess. But they can assess whether it is an unconditional withdrawal and acknowledgement that what I said was false and unfair and unjust. And to the extent that it involves the people coming together, looking into each other's eyes, it can do far more to recreate a sense of harmony in the community than simply awarding a big lump sum of damages to the winner and the loser going away with his or her tail between his or her legs. It presupposes a different network of relationships And it takes your reputation out of the market. As I said in my opinion, you don't quote your reputation on the stock exchange. And it's just mixing up two different and competing realms of integrity. The one is financial probity and strength, and the other is honor and dignity. So there's no question of buying forgiveness. It's a public acknowledgement that what I did was wrong. The only problem that I have, and it's referred to in the opinion, is that newspapers might just take a chance and say, okay, if we're wrong, we're going to say sorry, complete withdrawal, but the damage is already done. And in a world where the money market dominates so much, without the threat of some kind of retribution of that kind, maybe the temptation to take a chance and just apologize and pay the costs would be too great. But I still feel that apology has a huge role to play in dealing with various forms of injustice, particularly injustice to the soul, to the dignity, the integrity of people. Whether it's, and I feel that that's the most important kind of reparation that's needed. I happen to be in the United States. If I was in Australia, I could make the same point. It's the minute reparations get converted purely into dollars, or rands and cents, or pounds, whatever it might be, something goes wrong. The minute reparation focuses on human dignity and acknowledgement and the sense of Ubuntu and the implications of all living in one country with a divided history and a painful history, and acknowledging the repercussions and the consequences of that history and what it means for us today and the action we must take today, I think the greater the reparations. Reparations can mean, as after World War I, grabbing the plant, the machinery, and taking money out of the defeated country to restore the victorious country. It can mean the money paid, and I think correctly paid, to Holocaust survivors. But that is a very peculiar, particular historical circumstance. Reparation in its deepest sense means repair. Repair, 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 and you don't repair by money. You don't repair by money, and there's never enough. I remember when I came back to South Africa, my attorney friend, Michael Richmond, a wonderful friend and a great attorney, said, okay, Albie, we're going to sue the so-and-sos for your arm. And I said, Michael, what is my arm worth? A million, a trillion, a zillion, a quadrillion, trillion, zillion. But to live in a country where we have democracy, where we have freedom, that's everything. That justifies everything that we went through. It doesn't make it okay what we went through, but it means it wasn't meaningless and wanton. And then the repair comes through transformation. And so I think that's the basic answer to the question put there. Reparations, who's going to pay the reparations? Should Mandela and the Mandela government pay reparations when Mandela had been in prison for 27 years? Okay, the whites who benefited, the companies that benefited. But what we want from those companies is to deracialize them. We want fair labor practices. We want unions recognized. We want them to contribute towards the development of the country. We want them to help educate the working force. We want them to provide for scholarships and things like that that will enable the children of their workers to become the future owners and engineers and accountants and whatever it might be. And so the project is a much bigger one than simply transferring a certain amount of money from some people to other people. We do have forms of restitution. It's in the law, restitution in terms of people getting land back from which they were expelled, and our court has dealt with that quite extensively. But the reparations we want truly for South Africa is repairing our country, repairing the souls, repairing the fabric of our society, repairing the divisions that still keep people divided, repairing the inequalities that keep us divided. And that will bring about the transformation and the changes that we want. And I think, is that... and finally, did prosecutions ever happen? There wasn't prosecution in the case of the Beekles, Beekle, because there just isn't the evidence. There's the evidence that he died in police custody. But who was responsible and how? We've never broken through that. And you can't convict people simply because they were associated in some way or another with an offence without proof that they were directly implicated. So many lies were told, so many different stories. And that was another reason for having a truth commission. Who's going to be prosecuted? The person who pulled the trigger? The general who gave the command? The president of the country who provided the facilities and the go-ahead for all of that? That was another problem. And the logistics, which they have in Rwanda today, they just can't prosecute 50,000 people. And so they have village hearings, and again with an attempt at a kind of Ubuntu reconciliation and public hearings. Okay, this hearing has gone on for a long, long time. Thank you all.